In the 19th century, as China declined, two nations sought to expand into the resource-rich province of Manchuria. The Russian Empire, who wanted a warm water port in the Pacific, and newly industrialized Japan, who attacked China in the late 19th century and gained control over Korea and Taiwan. The tensions over the region resulted in the Russo-Japanese War in the early 20th century, which saw Japan take Port Arthur. A few years afterwards, the Qing dynasty collapsed, and China was divided amongst warlords, while Japan further expanded into the region by taking German concessions after World War I. Meanwhile, in 1917, the Russian Revolution saw the Soviets take power. In the civil war that followed, the Japanese joined the Western powers in trying to defeat the Communists. However, they failed, and the Russians managed to expand their control into the newly independent states of Mongolia and Tuva. Manchuria, on the other hand, was initially stabilized by the warlord Zhang Zuolin. He had aligned himself with the Japanese and even managed to take Beijing in the 1920s, but he was soon forced out of the city by the nationalists led by Chiang Kai-shek, which angered the growing Japanese militaristic factions, so they had him assassinated. Then in 1931, to prevent the nationalists from moving into Manchuria, the Japanese sabotaged their own railway line. This false flag, the Mukden incident, allowed them to move in and quickly capture the whole of Manchuria and created a puppet state, Manchukuo. Hundreds of border violations then took place, most of which were Soviet espionage missions, but they were largely peaceful. In the meantime, factions within the Japanese army, like the Imperial Way faction, were becoming more influential and began calling for an invasion of eastern Russia to secure resources. The first clash took place along the border in January 1935, when around 100 Mongolian cavalrymen assaulted a Manchukuo army patrol, and then in June a handful of Soviet troops attacked a Japanese patrol. Although these clashes would continue, they remained relatively small until 1938. Meanwhile, Japan had captured Chinese Inner Mongolia and formed a new puppet state, Mengjiang. Then, in July 1937, Japan invaded China following the Marco Polo Bridge incident. They advanced quickly and captured important cities like Nanking, Shanghai, and Beijing. Finally, in 1938, the Japanese army intercepted Soviet messages which told their troops to occupy strategic locations around Lake Khasan, so in July they attacked. However, the Soviets were quick to reinforce their positions and, after days of fighting, managed to hold their line. Unable to break through without escalating the war, the Japanese agreed to accept the border at the Tunmin River. However, the Japanese still contended the border with Mongolia. Both sides began building troops along the disputed territory as skirmishes intensified. Then, in the summer of 1939, the Japanese Kwantung Army, acting without orders from Tokyo, attacked. They bombed Soviet air bases and sent over 30,000 men to assault the Soviet positions. But the Soviets, who outnumbered the Japanese 2-1, were led by Zhukov. He was able to counter-attack by bombarding the Japanese and encircling them with armoured units. Plus, this battle coincided with Stalin signing the non-aggression pact with Hitler, meaning if a war were to escalate, Japan would be left isolated. Also, Japan's war in China had reached a stalemate. So in September, just after Germany invaded Poland, a ceasefire was signed. This failure halted Japan's attempts to move north, so they looked south for resources. The following year, they created the Great East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere and expanded into places like Burma and Indochina, while in Europe the Nazis took Paris. So, with both Japan and Russia preoccupied elsewhere, they signed a neutrality pact in April 1941, just 2 months before the Nazis invaded the USSR. And with no threat of war with the Soviets, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor later that year. Over the following years, the Nazis and Japanese were gradually pushed back. So, in early 1945, when the Nazis were on the brink of defeat, Stalin accepted to help the Allies in the Pacific War within 3 months of German surrender at the Yalta Conference. Germany eventually surrendered in May 1945, but the Japanese refused to accept the Allies' term of surrender in the Potsdam Declaration. So on the 6th of August, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. Then a couple days later, the Soviets invaded Manchuria with over 1 million men, despite the fact their neutrality pact did not expire for another year. The Soviets attacked Manchuria on 3 sides, capturing the Japanese army off guard. They were able to capture most of Manchuria in just over a week and threatened to take all of Korea. This worried the Americans, so the two agreed to divide Korea along the 38th parallel. Soviet troops first landed in Korea just a day before the Japanese finally surrendered. They then ended Pyongyang and helped install Kim Il-sung in power, while the Americans helped put the anti-communist Syngman Rhee in control of the south. Stalin then quickly transferred Manchuria to the Chinese Communists, which gave Mao Zedong one of the most developed regions in China and helped him win the Civil War.